cold exposure after resistance training in particular blunts the necessary inflammatory response. So you might remember when you were growing up, if you rolled your ankle, your mom and dad or your coach or whatever would do rest, ice, compression, elevation. So they'd put a frozen bag of peas on your ankle to reduce the swelling. Now, that's an acute injury at the joint. Actually, the person that founded the whole RICE protocol much later in his career walked that back and said something very, very important, which is blunting the inflammatory response is blunting the healing response. Inflammation occurs to protect your joint, to immobilize it, and also to encourage the flushing out of the inflammation, but the bringing of nutrients that are necessary for recovery. Now, if you apply that systemically and you think about muscles, well, that's the same kind of thing. We've got this old adage that when we lift weights, we're causing micro tears in the muscles. We're causing a temporary inflammatory response that breaks the body down so that the inflammatory response has to come in, the cytokines, the protein when you eat it, the muscle protein synthesis, the rebuild and the repair, the anabolic rebound, which is the resting, the recovery, the sleep, the fuel. And then hopefully you get the maximum return on your investment. You get the gains. If you interfere with that inflammatory response by jumping in the cold, which is known to blunt the inflammatory response, that you can actually diminish the return on your investment. You're not going to get as many gains.